A leaked internal memo just shattered Buckingham Palace's silence, and King Charles was forced to respond. What began as a private royal matter has now exploded into a full-blown crisis. The memo exposed more than words. It exposed cracks inside the monarchy. And now the king can't stay quiet. The internal memo that never should have been seen. It began behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace, with a confidential internal memo circulated among a small circle of senior aides. The document was never meant to travel beyond that inner ring. It wasn't dressed up in careful language or filtered through palace lawyers. Instead, it was direct, blunt, and unusually honest. The memo addressed a sensitive internal issue that had been deliberately kept out of the public eye for months, possibly even years. What made the memo dangerous wasn't just what it said, but how it said it. The tone lacked the usual royal caution. There were no soft phrases, no carefully balanced wording. One insider later said, "This wasn't written to survive daylight." And yet, daylight was exactly where it ended up. Somewhere inside the system, someone made a decision. Whether it was frustration, fear, or calculation remains unclear. But the result was the same. The memo leaked, not dumped online all at once, but released in pieces. A sentence here, a phrase there. Enough to spark attention without revealing the full picture. By the time palace officials realized what had happened, the memo had already entered media circles. Royal correspondents began quietly checking sources. Phones lit up. Emails flew. Once reporters started confirming it was real, we knew it was over, a palace source admitted. The palace's greatest strength, control, had cracked. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a breach of trust. Internal communication at the palace is built on silence and discretion. The leak suggested that those foundations were no longer solid. And worse, it signaled that someone inside wanted this information out. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. This memo had crossed a line it could never uncross. What should have remained locked in palace files had become a liability. And with every passing hour, the cost of saying nothing was rising. Which leads directly to the next problem the palace could no longer ignore. Why the memo triggered immediate alarm. The panic didn't come from embarrassment alone, it came from risk. The memo touched on a deeply personal royal matter, one that had been carefully managed in public statements since 2024. What the palace had told the world no longer matched what the memo suggested behind the scenes. That contradiction was explosive. The language revealed internal disagreement, not speculation, not rumors, but clear tension within the royal household. One line, now widely quoted, hinted that consensus had never truly existed. As one royal commentator put it, the memo exposed cracks the palace spent years plastering over. For senior aides, this was the worst-case scenario. The monarchy survives on consistency. Once the public senses mixed messages, credibility collapses. Palace officials immediately understood that if the memo kept circulating unchecked, every past statement would be re-examined. Every silence would look suspicious. What made the situation worse was timing. This leak came at a moment when King Charles was already navigating pressure. Health concerns, shifting roles, and growing scrutiny of palace transparency. The memo poured fuel on an already smoldering fire. It turned a controlled narrative into a moving target, said a former aide. Silence, usually the palace's safest move, suddenly became dangerous. The longer they said nothing, the more the memo appeared to speak for them. Advisors warned that public trust could erode in days, not weeks. One insider recalled a stark message delivered during an emergency call. If we don't address this, the memo becomes the truth. The alarm wasn't about gossip, it was about authority. About whether the king still controlled the story, or whether that power had slipped into someone else's hands. From that moment on, the palace wasn't asking if a response was needed. It was asking how fast it had to happen. And that urgency set off a chain reaction no one could stop. How the leak reached the outside world. The leak didn't explode, it slipped. A whisper in a newsroom. A forwarded line in a private email. At first, only a select few journalists knew something was coming. The internal memo, never meant for the public, landed in the hands of trusted royal correspondents, and before long, its authenticity was being quietly confirmed behind the scenes. By the afternoon of Wednesday, palace phones were ringing non-stop. Press officers scrambled to trace where the breach had come from. But it was too late. The content had already jumped from whispers to printed words. 3 major outlets were tipped off within hours. Each one confirmed the memo was genuine before publishing the first headline. "It was like watching the gates open slowly," said one royal reporter. "You knew the storm was coming, just not how hard it would hit." Inside Buckingham Palace, trust fractured instantly. Senior aides suspected one another. An internal network audit was launched, but by then, the narrative had already slipped out of royal hands. This wasn't a rumor. It was a real, written document. And it was now part of the public record. The biggest shock wasn't that something leaked. It was what leaked. The memo wasn't gossip. It was structured, official, and written by someone close to the top. It carried authority. And once it was out there, King Charles no longer had the luxury of shaping the message on his terms. Control, once lost, could not be recovered. And now all eyes turned to the man at the center of the monarchy, waiting for a reaction. King Charles' initial reaction behind closed doors. By 7 a.m. the following day, King Charles had been briefed. The conversation was blunt. The memo was real, the leak was wide, and the media wasn't backing off. The king, already managing ongoing health treatments, now faced a second crisis, one far more political than personal. Advisors didn't waste time. They told him outright, this would grow fast. "You can't wait this out," one aide reportedly said. Charles listened. He wasn't angry, but he was deeply unsettled. The issue the memo touched on was something he had intentionally kept out of public discussion for nearly 6 months. Now, he faced a decision with no perfect option. He could stay silent and let speculation run wild, or speak and risk drawing even more attention to the very issue he had tried to protect. Delay, his aides warned, would allow others to define the story. For a monarch who had built his reign on deliberate control, that was not acceptable. He understood immediately this wasn't about content anymore, said one insider. It was about perception. And that's what forced his hand. The king didn't shout. He didn't storm out. But everyone in the room understood. Something had fundamentally shifted. A private boundary had been crossed, and now a public line had to be drawn. And that meant one thing. The king would have to speak, whether he wanted to or not. The sensitive issue Charles could no longer avoid. Buried in the leaked memo was a reference that made everything worse. It pointed to ongoing internal strain inside the royal structure. It didn't name names, but the message was unmistakable. Something behind palace walls wasn't working. The language hinted at disagreements over roles, health duties, or succession responsibilities, and suddenly, the public had a window into what the palace had kept sealed for months. This wasn't just about operations, it was about trust, control, and who's really making decisions at the top. Royal observers noted one line in particular that stood out. Re-evaluations may be necessary if stability is compromised. It was the kind of phrase that says everything without saying anything. And it was now in the hands of the media. The timing couldn't have been worse. Charles was still balancing his health treatments quietly, and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had also stepped back from public duties due to her own medical concerns. The memo's vague wording sparked wild speculation. Was this about Kate? Was this about Camilla? Was William being positioned to take on more? Suddenly, the public wasn't just curious. They were demanding answers. Social media lit up with theories. TV panels debated royal stability, and every headline carried the same undertone. What is the palace hiding? Charles had hoped to keep this situation controlled, measured, and above all, private. But now the context had been ripped away, and if he didn't address it himself, others would fill in the blanks for him. He didn't want to reveal too much, but silence was no longer an option. The palace scrambles to shape a response. The response didn't happen overnight, but inside the palace, the pace was urgent. By Thursday afternoon, emergency meetings were underway. The king's communications team, senior aides, and legal advisors all gathered in a tense room behind closed doors. Every single word of the upcoming statement was debated. Some fought for transparency, others warned of long-term consequences if too much was said. There was one critical split. Should they clarify the issue the memo referenced, or keep it vague to avoid adding fuel to the fire? "We had no perfect option," said one insider close to the team. "It was either reveal too much or say too little and lose control anyway." Every suggestion came with risk. The pressure was mounting from media, politicians, and even foreign governments who had seen the leak and were asking quiet questions of their own. Meanwhile, King Charles remained involved in every stage of the decision-making. Aides say he asked detailed questions, insisted on reviewing drafts himself, and made clear that the final tone had to reflect calm leadership, not panic. In the end, the choice came down to him. One advisor put it simply, "The crown may be symbolic, but the responsibility is very real. Only he could decide how to speak." And once the message was agreed upon, the world held its breath for the king's next move. How Charles was forced to speak. By Friday morning, the pressure had boiled over. What started as a quiet leak had become a full-blown media storm. Headlines were multiplying by the hour. "Royal memo sparks internal crisis," read one outlet. Another asked directly, "Why is the palace staying silent?" Even the most loyal publications couldn't hold back. Behind the scenes, King Charles knew what was happening. His aides were fielding non-stop calls. TV crews began camping outside Clarence House. The sense of urgency turned into panic, not from the public, but from inside the palace walls. A senior source admitted the silence was starting to feel like confirmation. The king had no choice. He had to say something, not because he wanted to, but because doing nothing would do more damage. He didn't want the narrative shaped by tabloids or Twitter threads. And more importantly, he didn't want the monarchy to look like it was hiding from the truth. It was no longer about managing a leak. It was about protecting the institution. What followed wasn't a planned press conference or televised statement. It was a carefully worded message, issued through official palace channels with Charles's signature tone, calm, composed, and deeply measured. But make no mistake, it only happened because of outside pressure. He was forced to speak. There was no version of this where silence survived. A former royal advisor commented bluntly, "This wasn't a move of confidence, it was a move of necessity. They were backed into a corner." The king's message didn't solve the crisis, but it contained it. For now, his team hoped it would cool speculation, reset the headlines, and keep the monarchy from becoming the story for the wrong reasons. Whether it worked is still up for debate. But one thing was certain, this wasn't a proactive statement. It was a reaction under pressure. And the real message was between the lines. What Charles said, and carefully didn't say. When the official statement dropped just after 12:30 p.m., it came through all major royal communication channels. The message, attributed directly to King Charles, struck a tone of measured reassurance. He acknowledged recent concerns surrounding the direction of royal responsibilities and emphasized his ongoing commitment to unity and transparency. But for those reading closely, what stood out wasn't what the king said. It was what he didn't say. He never directly addressed the memo. He never confirmed or denied its contents. No names were mentioned, not Camilla, not William, not Catherine, and the sensitive matter at the center of the leak remained deliberately vague. One line read, "Certain discussions meant for internal review have unfortunately surfaced without context." It was as close to an admission as the palace was willing to get. The choice of words was precise. Calm, but not cold. Open, but not revealing. And most of all, strategic. The goal wasn't to explain everything. The goal was to regain control of the narrative without deepening the damage. The king is addressing public concern while respecting the need for privacy within the family, the statement concluded. But that sentence, polite and polished, only fueled more speculation. Was this about health? Succession? Internal roles? No answers were given. Royal commentators called it a masterclass in deflection. One veteran broadcaster said, "He walked right up to the line, but never crossed it." The statement worked in calming some corners of the media, but for many, it raised more questions than it answered. And in a twist, what Charles chose not to say ended up dominating the next news cycle. The story had shifted again. It was no longer just about the leak. It was about the monarchy's new communication strategy under pressure. And even after the king's words, one thing remained true. The real story wasn't over. It was just beginning to unfold. Fallout inside the royal household. Once King Charles's carefully worded statement went public, the media frenzy began to cool, out there beyond the palace gates. But inside Buckingham Palace, it was a different reality. The public may have been partially satisfied, but for those working behind the scenes, the real storm was just beginning. The leak of that internal memo wasn't seen as just a scandal. It was a breach of trust at the highest level, one that struck directly at the heart of how the monarchy operates. For decades, the royal household has prided itself on its discipline, confidentiality, and absolute loyalty. This moment shattered that image. It was no longer just a matter of public perception. It was a personal betrayal, and the atmosphere inside the palace changed overnight. Within 24 hours of the leak, an internal investigation was quietly launched. There were no official announcements, no dramatic firings, and no public denials. Just a subtle but intense operation designed to trace the origin of the leak. IT teams began reviewing access logs, cross-checking emails, and monitoring internal communications. Key documents were pulled from circulation. Some aides, previously trusted, were reassigned or temporarily removed from key meetings. Others were warned to tighten their circles and minimize sharing. even with colleagues they'd worked alongside for years. The result was chilling. "There's now a chilling effect. Everyone's watching their words," one insider told a royal correspondent. Tasks that once took minutes were now taking hours. Every written note was being reviewed, revised, and re-reviewed, often with legal eyes involved. Routine schedules, updates, and drafts were being triple-checked before even reaching a senior royal's desk. But beyond the procedural freeze came something deeper: the emotional cost. Long-standing relationships among senior staff began to deteriorate. Suspicion crept into conversations. Collaboration gave way to caution. "We've gone from open doors to locked ones," one longtime staffer was overheard saying. Meetings that once involved 10 people now included 3. Discussions once had in passing were now avoided entirely. People weren't just protecting the crown, they were protecting themselves. The ripple effect even reached Clarence House in Kensington Palace, where aides working with Prince William and Princess Catherine reportedly requested fewer cross-briefings with Charles's team. "Everyone's tightening up," said one insider, noting that the fallout was now influencing inter-household communication too. And then there was the personal impact on King Charles himself. Known for valuing loyalty above all else, the idea that someone in his inner circle had betrayed that trust left him visibly disappointed, according to sources close to the family. He did not lash out, but aides say the tone of meetings became colder, more formal, more distant. This wasn't just a stumble in royal messaging. It fundamentally altered the palace's internal rhythm, the way information is handled, the way people interact, and the way trust is extended. From now on, every internal decision will be seen through the lens of, could this leak? As one former courtier put it starkly, this wasn't just a mistake. It changed how the palace functions, possibly for good. And for a monarchy already facing modern challenges, that kind of shift could be the most dangerous outcome of all. Why this moment matters for Charles's reign. In the long and often tightly controlled timeline of royal history, a leaked memo might seem like a small stumble, a footnote rather than a headline. But for King Charles III, this was anything but minor. This was the first true crisis of authority in his reign, and it happened just a few years into a role he waited 7 decades to inherit. The leak didn't just break protocol, it pierced the image of a monarchy built on silence, loyalty, and absolute discretion. Until now, Charles had presented himself as a stable ceremonial monarch, carefully continuing the legacy of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, while making quiet shifts toward modern relevance. His leadership was seen as thoughtful, slow-moving, and focused on unity. But this single moment, the leaking of one confidential document, shattered that perception. What the leak exposed wasn't just internal disagreement, it revealed a structural vulnerability. That the monarchy, even with centuries of experience and the most seasoned advisors, is not immune to the risks of modern exposure. If one private memo could reach reporters, who's to say it ends there? What if a second leak carries names, or worse, decisions not yet made public? This was a wake-up call not just for Charles, but for the entire royal system. As one former palace official put it, the crown rests on tradition, but tradition can't protect against technology or betrayal. The speed with which the memo spread, from internal inboxes to tabloid headlines, proved that even Buckingham Palace is vulnerable to the pace of a digital world. According to royal insiders and experts, this moment is already reshaping palace operations. Expect tighter communication chains, more selective access, and possibly even the reassignment of staff. Advisors who once had the king's ear may now find themselves on the sidelines. Meetings may be shorter, rooms smaller, and documents shared only with initials, if at all. One constitutional scholar summed it up plainly. Charles now knows his own circle isn't leak-proof. That changes everything. But perhaps the bigger revelation is how this moment shattered the illusion that the palace can still operate under old rules. In the past, royals could contain a crisis by simply not commenting. Now, everything is faster, louder, and harder to control. A screenshot travels faster than a press release. A single sentence can undo months of messaging. And for a monarch still carving out his place in history, this incident may redefine how he governs, communicates, and trusts those around him. It might mean fewer public appearances, more scripted transparency, and tighter management of the royal narrative. Because when the palace loses its grip on what stays private, it also begins to lose its power over perception. This wasn't just a leak, it was a signal that the rules have changed. And from this moment on, so will King Charles. This wasn't how King Charles expected to handle things, certainly not this early in his reign. But when a confidential memo leaked and the truth hit the headlines, he had no choice. What was meant to stay hidden is now public, and the king's carefully measured leadership has been pushed into the spotlight. The fallout has already begun, internally and externally. Trust inside the palace is shaken, roles are being reevaluated, and the royal family's ability to control its own narrative has taken a serious blow. Charles didn't want to speak, but he had to, and the way he responded, cautious, calculated, and carefully worded, says everything about how he plans to face challenges moving forward. The monarchy has survived worse. But make no mistake, this moment exposed real vulnerabilities. And the king's next steps could shape his reign more than any speech, ceremony, or tradition ever could.